best advice?
Never stop laughing at yourself. And that might sound like quite superficial advice for coming from a philosopher, but I think it's actually better advice than know thyself. Because what I've tended to find is that it's the spirit of gravity that stops people moving. There's a point where they take something very seriously, and that tends to happen at some point in your life. And at that point you are fixed. You start to ossify and fossilize slowly once you've discovered the non-negotiables.
Welcome to the Rogue L&D Hot Shots podcast, a short podcast allowing you to meet some of the brilliant folk driving people performance and development forward in an informal and human way. My name's Tom Bailey, award-winning L&D leader and passionate maverick for all things development. Join me as I ask just 10 questions of some of the industry's most innovative and interesting people. Tell us about yourself.
Hi, I'm Nick. I think the first question is, who are you? Which I found such an interesting question in a sort of annoying way because my background is philosophy and psychology. So I think you can sort of answer that in a superficial way. Like, what is it that you do to make money? And the answer is I run my own learning consultancy and I help big organizations to improve what they're doing with learning, to get better results, to improve the experience for people. But I think you can also answer it in terms of, what are you here to do? Well, why are you here on this planet? And I suppose I'm an emissary is the best word and the best descriptor I can come up with. So I'm here to bring some of the future into the present. So I think that's what I do. And I think that's how I make money.
What are you passionate about?
I think my passion in L&D is a subset of what I'm really passionate about. So I became really passionate about understanding things, in particular understanding the universe. And understanding people. And that was why I studied what I studied. And I think I eventually figured out an understanding of people, and that meant applications to learning and development. So within learning and development, I have a passion which derives from an understanding of people, which is how can we create experiences which transform people? And how can we really help people with the challenges that they already face? And so I'm passionate about improving for organizations the experience that people have and also the performance that they're able to accomplish within organizations.
What's the best L&D you've seen?
Some of the best things that I've seen happening within learning and development aren't your conventional educational things. So 2 examples, briefly. One was at the BBC where it was all essentially about internal mobility. They had a kind of a swap shop where there was a board where you could post assignments or secondments. We need a runner to work on EastEnders for a couple of weeks, and then you could apply for that. And if you got it, your manager was absolutely fine with that. So it was enabled by that kind of a mindset that was okay to do those things. Just imagine how fantastic that is. You're constantly trying out different things. It's like sort of if you're old enough to remember Mr. Ben, you try out a different kind of uniform. But the other thing I remember asking a very senior partner at Deloitte what had been instrumental in her development. And she said, well, it was when a leader asked me to lead a meeting for the first time, and I'd never done that. I was a bit anxious about it, but they supported me and I did it and I grew hugely in confidence. And it's a lovely little almost fable about the reality of learning, that it's led by challenges, but also enabled by supportive people around you.
Favorite hand gesture?
So my favorite hand gesture is this one. And I, growing up, it was just a Trekkie. Yeah, I mean, I still do. I love the James T. Kirk, but also the Jean-Luc Picard, and also actually one of my favorite captains, Captain Janeway. But the kind of the Vulcan hand gesture, live long and prosper, that I think is got to be my favorite hand gesture.
One thing you didn't learn.
So your question is, what's something that you got better at without, in quotes, learning? And the quotes are significant because I took that to mean that you're referring to education, because generally, for 99% of the time when people talk about learning, they're actually talking about education. So this question means something like, what did you learn without education? So I interpreted it in that way. And I think that was basically people stuff. I didn't really have any aptitude for people. And the way that this sort of showed up was in meetings when I went to kind of corporate life. You could sort of hide whilst you're an academic. And certainly when I was a psychology lecturer, and you're just sort of talking at people. You don't really need to have people skills. But in business, I would just sort of say things into meetings and discover that those were experienced as disruptive. And it really, I think, was a whole decade, really, frankly, of annoying people and sort of having this sort of dim awareness that I was this sort of nuisance, that actually to get your ideas across, it's not just the what you're saying, it's also how you're saying it. So even simple ideas like building on what other people are saying, those were things that I sort of learned, I think, the hard way.
Proudest moment?
The thing that I'm most proud of is the discovery of learning and cognition. As somebody who is a philosopher and a psychologist, that's a question that people have been struggling with for thousands of years. So to have made that kind of progress, I think, is significant. It's obvious to me that that won't be something that I can expect anybody else to recognize in my lifetime. I'm gradually reconciling myself, I think, to that. But on a more mundane level, I think I was just super proud of the work that I saw my team do in various roles, actually, where they were given a little bit of space to do something different and did just extraordinary and creative and life-changing things, capturing stories from around the world, making people in organizations at all levels feel proud of the work that we were doing together. And yes, I'm proud of both of those things, the intellectual and the everyday.
Worst experience in L&D?
I think L&D is always bad. It's always a terrible experience when it's education. Yeah, so let me qualify that. And so a lot of L&D descends into this kind of pit, this sort of black hole of being education. And the worst example of that, I was working on a project where I had to go through an induction program, and it was 2 days sitting in a room, and the person who showed up started by saying that they were not the person who was supposed to be there because the person who was supposed to be there was ill. And then they just read a script for 2 days straight, accompanied by various PowerPoints. And they just had no personal investment in what they were saying. And it was all scripted, which of course begs the question, why on earth are we sitting here? There was no room for questions because the person couldn't have answered them in any case. And every so often they would sort of wheel in like a TV, like I used to do back in the day. And they're just going to play a short video about safety or something like that. It was just utterly dreadful. It just made me feel like I was, back at school and all of the horrors of that experience.
Best celebrity moment?
I have hardly ever met a celebrity, and I don't know if that's because I don't have a particular kind of aspiration. I wasn't the sort of people who stood in line to kind of queue for pop bands when I was younger. I would have been far cooler if I had been, frankly. But I think the only people that spring to mind is Colin Powell. I was at a learning event in the US, and you know how it is when you've done a big job and you retire and you think, what am I going to do now? And you get asked to speak at events. And he had to stand in front of a screen and sort of shake hands. And I always think it's always got to be so miserable for those celebrities just to have people come up and, kind of feign interest and then off they go. But I like the idea of a different kind of celebrity meet. And so I think towards the top of my list would be Jeff Goldblum. It would be cool, I think. He's somewhat reclusive, so I think it's highly unlikely, but I have this wizard wheeze about how maybe we'll meet. So, it would be nice. And I can imagine it as being a much more kind of fun experience. But yeah, I'm largely bereft of celebrity stories, which is sad, I realise.
Something you believed but nobody else did?
So I think The Emperor's New Clothes is, I'm not sure if it's the defining story of my life, but it's certainly a huge part of my life, without self-aggrandizement, I hope, because I spend a lot of time talking on shifting from education to learning. And that's basically me running around saying, look, stop what you're doing. It's a complete and utter waste of time. Do this thing over here instead, which is actually learning. You're calling yourself learning professionals, but what you're doing is this weird kind of ritual where you kind of try and push content at people and they're not engaged and it has no return on investment, but you're just kind of persisting with it. Please stop. It's not doing anybody any good. Let's start doing learning. What is learning? Well, learning is either creating challenging experiences or helping people with the experiences they've got. So I do that a lot. And I think it's been instructive for me because there's a kind of existence that you have where you reach the realization, where you're an explorer, if you like, where you can say, look, I think I've finally figured out what learning is. And then what you realize is that you can't just run around the town square yelling that at people and expect them to change. You realize that success in your life has shifted from being discovering the thing to, now that you've discovered the thing, how are you going to communicate it in a way to people where you don't completely lose them? So a lot more, I think, the last part of my career has been, storytelling and hand-holding, and how do you connect with people and how do you go at the right pace for them to come to the same conclusion. So yes, very much an Emperor's New Clothes. And what I've learned from that story is that you can't just say to people, you're naked. You have to say, maybe try this on for size. Maybe this would look a little better on you.
Best advice?
Never stop laughing at yourself. And that might sound like quite superficial advice for coming from a philosopher, but I think it's actually better advice than know thyself. Because what I've tended to find is that it's the spirit of gravity that stops people moving. There's a point where they take something very seriously, and that tends to happen at some point in your life. And at that point, you are fixed. You start to ossify and fossilize slowly once you've discovered the non-negotiables. So constantly being able to kind of laugh at yourself keeps you on the move. It means you're not too attached to any particular set of values or point of view. And that keeps you open to otherness and to difference. So having a sense of humor about you, and especially being able to laugh at yourself, will keep you growing and developing and, well, keep you young to some extent.
Thank you to our guest and to you for listening. If you want to boost the impact of your organisation's people development practices, I'd love to connect. You can find me at thomasbailey.co. Alternatively, you can look me up on LinkedIn.